On behalf of Pakhuis de Zwijger, I would like to welcome you tonight. My name is Ilse Verhagen. I'm a PhD candidate conducting research on refugee children and families and their mental health, and I work as a child psychologist on a team providing care for asylum seekers. I organized the event tonight together with Max de Ploeg. This event is part of the Justice for Palestine series that focuses on context of colonization, apartheid, and military occupation of Palestine. The series was organized to engage in dialogue promoting justice, equality, and peace for everyone between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It is also the first event of the brand new Dutch branch of the Palestine Global Mental Health Network. For a very brief introduction to the history of Palestine, I will read from the introduction of the book co-written by Lara Shia, one of the speakers tonight. I will quote, "European Jewish Zionist settlers, with the aid of European powers, ethnically cleansed historic Palestine of 700,000 inhabitants, 70% of its population, in 1947-1948, prevented their return to their homes and destroyed more than 400 villages. The West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza, as well as Syrian Golan, were illegally occupied in 1967, and the Israeli state actively colonized and continues to disenfranchise the Palestinian population, including the mass incarceration and siege of Gaza since 2007. We call it historic Palestine from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River because Palestine is a country and it remains occupied. This is not turgid pedantry, but empirical fact. Likewise, we are ethically and scholarly compelled to identify the state now known as Israel as an apartheid state." End quote. In the past several months since the violent attack by Hamas on October 7th of the last year, we have witnessed a humanitarian catastrophe unfold caused by unprecedented violence at the hands of the Israeli state. At this moment, more than 35,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, men, women, and children. 2 million people in Gaza have been displaced. Israeli bombings have destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes, schools, and hospitals. The health system has collapsed and humanitarian aid has been blocked from entering Gaza. The ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, genocide in Gaza, and the complicity of Western governments has ignited protests and solidarity movements across the globe, calling for a ceasefire and liberation of historic Palestine. Tonight, we'll be talking about the role of mental health professionals when confronted by these extreme human rights violations that are being supported by our own governments. Together with the speakers on the panel, we'll be discussing the role of politics in the field of mental health and what happens when we disconnect the two. We will also be discussing what it means for mental health professionals to speak up about Palestine and the therapeutic potential of the global solidarity movements. Before we continue to the panel discussion, we will listen to a story by Sophie Khatib. Sophie is a public speaker and storyteller. He writes and delivers talks on topics such as diversity and inclusion, and tonight he will be speaking about as an expert by experience. Ahlan wa sahlan, Sophie.
I will use the mic, so hopefully you hear me better. I would like to share some of the things I got exposed to related to mental health since I opened my eyes. And I would say the first thing I realized that you cannot really understand much about something that you don't know, that is not talked about. And the very first story I want to talk about is when I was about 11, 12, and I started to understand a little bit the environment around me. And the word Nakba came for the first time. For those 12 years before that, I never heard this word. You're living in a situation, there are so many things that are unsaid. You feel it. Whenever I go with my family to a swimming pool, which of course it will be in the Israeli Jewish nearby town, you will see some power dynamic between your parents and those other people. You will see how when you want to interact with other kids, there are other parents who would say, no, 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 no. Actually, the last time I saw that was last year in May. And I was with a friend and with his little child and our little daughter, and his child saw another child and wanted to play with that child in the pool when the mom pulled her daughter and said, we don't play with those guys. But then again, I will take you to when I was 12 and I understood that something big happened in 48. And I went to the first source that I would ask, my grandma. And I said, Grandma, tell me about 1948. And she was like, well, what do you need to know? The Jews came, they took the land, there's Israel, that's it. I'm like, okay, great, but what's your experience? No. Grandma, no, come on, you want me to go to jail? That's it, it's okay. And I don't want to tell you more about that because it took me other couple of years to get few sentences about that event. And those few sentences came with a flood of tears, anger, and followed by a lot of silence. I grew up a little bit more, and then I went to university. And I went to study psychology. And I went to study this topic, honestly, because I didn't know what I want to study, but I thought psychology can be later combined with anything. So it's a good topic to study. But while studying that topic, it was interesting how the examples we were giving during the class were not really from my environment. So we will talk about traumatized soldiers. We will talk about how you would live through the experience of having a suicide bomber doing something in your city. But all the things that you learn, even like there was one time the professor wanted to give us an example about how the difference between short-term memory and long-term memory works. And so he wrote this long number on the board. And he's like, okay, for 3 seconds, try to memorize it. And then he deleted. And then he's like, who remembers this number? And no one of us could. And he's like, well, now you would learn how to. This was 48, 67, 73. And this was the long number. Because from his perspective, it's about the wars of Israel. And of course, we all need to know it. This also came until the end of my master's, and I wanted to make my thesis about love and relationship in the Palestinian society in Israel. And I went to my supervisor and I said, this is the topic I would like to write about. And her reaction was like, yeah, but how can you do something like this in a very conservative society like yours? How can you talk about love and relationships? And for me, it was also interesting how much you will think someone understands some aspects, I would say, but some others somehow it faded away. And part of my bachelor degree was also to go to a psychologist myself. The nearest Arabic-speaking psychologist to where I was living in the center of Tel Aviv was 1.5 hours to 2 hours. And I didn't really want to travel 4 hours to see a psychologist to fulfill my degree. So I went to someone living a bit closer, an Israeli psychologist that she was living, I would say, few bus stops from my home. And I went to her and I wanted to share with her some of the struggles or the things that I have. But I ended my own treatment there after a few months because I felt I'm in a place where I need to explain her things that I thought are very simple. Very simple. Like the way I feel when I see a soldier. The way I react when there is a violent event happening, the way that I relate to some people that I consider part of my bigger identity and nation, the way I felt when I went to Jordan or Egypt for the first time and I'm surrounded for the first time with people who speak my language and I hear it everywhere. Things that for me were new. But for her, it was hard to understand. And after I felt our sessions became more educational sessions than my own sessions, I decided I don't want to pay and educate at the same time. So I resigned. And 2 years ago, I decided that I want to go to a psychologist here in the Netherlands. But because I already have had some experiences, I thought I wanted someone with a systematic approach that understands a little bit more than me individually. I wanted someone that have lived in another country, which is, funnily enough, I wanted someone that have my lived experience, not as a foreigner in the Netherlands, but as a foreigner in my own country. And I got a psychologist. She's great. She didn't fulfill all the conditions, unfortunately. And for the first while, I was very happy that she wasn't Arabic speaking or even know nothing about the Middle East, because I thought, well, now she will not take anything for granted. We can discuss some things. And that was going great until October. Because after October, I was telling her about how I feel and how life is becoming for me. And she could try to understand. She could try to relate. But sometimes I felt there are some very basic facts that when she asked me about, I was like, okay, wait a second. So what did you understand before? And that was, for example, when she asked me once, oh, so you have an Israeli passport? I'm like, yes. Why would I go to an Israeli university otherwise? It's not that I traveled there it's the only university I can go to. But then after a few sessions, she made a comment that made me stop and go out of my seat as a patient. It wasn't, do you condemn Hamas? But it was very close to that. It was, I hear you speak a lot about Israel and how it affects your life. How come you never speak about Hamas? And I looked at her, I'm like, do you understand? First of all, I have never, ever encountered any Hamas person. Never. So they didn't affect my life, no. And second, I think I'm talking about, the environment I was brought up in and how that thing. So I was telling her, how I feel when I go to the gate at Schiphol and I hear Hebrew, and how my trip to Tel Aviv airport and then to home, and how all of this experience. And she's like, yeah, but, you're making it like Subhi versus Israel. Just take it smaller. What? Did anyone harm you? I'm like, no, it's not that they harmed me, but I feel something. And I felt sometimes that I need to question how do I feel, and to make it more personal, because this group thing maybe need to be minimized. So I'm still going through my own journey with all of this. And sometimes I really doubt, would it have made a difference if that very first psychologist was a Palestinian? Would it have made a difference if my grandmother was able to talk about her own trauma? Would it have made any difference if I'm here tonight and I'm sharing my story? I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for sharing a story with us. We will now continue with the panel discussion. I would like to give a warm welcome to the speakers. Rana Nashashibi is calling from Jerusalem, where she was born and raised. She is director of the Palestine Counseling Center, a clinician, and a community activist. Welcome, Rana. Lara Shiha is calling from the US. She's a Lebanese clinician and an assistant professor of clinical psychology at Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, where she focuses on decolonial and liberatory psychoanalysis. Together with Stephen Shiha, she's author of the book Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. For this book, she worked closely together with Rana and other Palestinian clinicians. Samrat Ghana is a clinical psychologist, medical anthropologist, and senior researcher. He develops culturally sensitive mental health care programs for migrants and refugees in the Netherlands. Welcome, Sam. Donna Pietra Müller is a psychiatrist and a researcher on diversity and inclusion in the field of mental health. Donna is currently conducting research on experiences in the workplace with regards to discussing the topic of Palestine and Israel. Welcome, Donna. At the end of the panel discussion, there will be room for Q&A for any questions from the audience. I've prepared some questions for you myself. Lara, in your book, you have quoted a clinician from Ramallah. She said that if the first true goal of mental health professionals is to attend to the suffering of the patient, then shouldn't mental health care be a mechanism for social and political mobilization? The position of mental health professionals outside of their clinical setting is an important point of discussion tonight. Can you reflect on the statement of this clinician?
Thank you, Elsie. And did you want me to start? I know this is a larger question.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. Saphi, Sam, Donna, and of course, Rana. It's always a pleasure. And thank you, Elsie and Max, for making this happen. You know, perhaps it's not by chance that it's a Palestinian who said this. And I think that that is the center for us, that when we're talking about engaged clinicians, and here I'll call in our comrade Bassel Al-Araj, who asked us to think about everybody being an engaged intellectual, right? And so I think there's a way in which we can extend that to the mental health field and say, what does it mean to be an engaged clinician? And engaged being a responsibility and an ethical alignment and imperative for us not to split off the psychic from the social and the political, right? And I think when I say it's not by chance that a Palestinian clinician has said this, it's because life in Palestine is circumscribed by political decisions that are dictated by a settler colonial regime. You laid the groundwork for that. Subhi, mentioned very movingly even small examples of that. And so for us to think that people can exist in a space that's devoid of politics is also saying that we are extending a luxury that perhaps some people have and other people don't. And this is the issue of neutrality for me. The other thing that I want to say is that, a lot of times clinician colleagues will say to me, well, what you're asking us to do is to, tell people who to vote for and to tell people what to think. And I think that that might be a simplified version of what we're talking about when we talk about politics. When I say we talk about political mobilization, it's to understand that the very being of people and what lives inside of them are formed by structures, usually those that are oppressive in nature, like capitalism, like racial capitalism, like patriarchy, like imperialism and colonialism. And those things are not evenly distributed in terms of how they come to live inside people and the ways in which people negotiate their being every single day. The fact that we can think of that as not having a psychic component is a deeply irresponsible idea, particularly for clinicians. How we navigate and negotiate the world comes to reflect psychically in us. And I think that in many ways, the idea that we're saying clinicians must also be political actors is also being honest about the way in which our field, our theories also came into being in political structures, and ones that, again, unevenly distributed responsibility for oppressive structures. And then, of course, we get into the idea about whose narratives are heard. So Pei did a beautiful job in bringing that forward in a very concrete way, right? What are we attuned to and what are we not attuned to? Who are we more likely to listen to and who not? These are all political questions, let alone the politics of diagnoses, of ableism, all these sorts of, so we're already in the realm of politics. And I think that needs to be our starting point rather than it be a question of, do we do politics or not? It's saying our work is squarely political. And the ways in which we shepherd psychic life and witness alongside people the type of suffering, and maybe call in people like Frantz Fanon, who was dedicated to the alleviation of psychic suffering. If that is our starting point, then it feels like being an engaged clinician is the bare minimum that we can do. I have a lot more thoughts, but I'll stop there because I'm excited to hear from others as well.
Lara, you pointed out Frantz Fanon. Could you tell a little bit more about him and his work? I know you're inspired by his work a lot.
Yes. Frantz Fanon was a Martinican psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who came to be known as an honorary Algerian. And most importantly, he's a Black psychiatrist and revolutionary. He was a Marxist and a psychoanalyst. And he brought us books like Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Masks and Dying Colonialism. And his legacy lives on, particularly in the global South. I mean, one of the things we're seeing now in the context of the global North is a way in which psychologists, perhaps clinicians, talk about a renaissance of Fanon. But that idea itself brings us back to the question, because for many people who are growing up in the global South, Fanon never went away, because Fanon was dedicated to this idea that there is no separation between the psychic and the political and the social. So he came up with the idea of sociogeny, meaning the intrapsychic and the political are intricately interwoven in the ways in which people experience life. Most importantly, though, in his revolutionary spirit, he was saying it is our imperative as clinicians to always hold that in mind and to take care not to reproduce social functions that disinvite people from their own revolutionary potential. He was not scared to say that people, particularly people who are oppressed and colonized people, know who their oppressor is. And so it's on us not to confuse them and to actually walk alongside them and help in the ways we can, both as engaged clinicians, but also in the room to mobilize, but most importantly, back to your question, to not demobilize, because that's what we actually see happening far more often, right? Even in a so-called innocent question, like, why don't you talk about Hamas? That is perhaps a great example of a demobilized psychopolitical affective moment. And I think that for me, that's the biggest gift that Fanon, as a Black thinker, as somebody who thought about race, who thought about logics, who thought about colonialism, without the pressure to disconnect that from the psychic.
Thank you so much. Rana, I would like to ask you a question. Palestine is often viewed through a lens of trauma and victimhood. Laura just spoke about the politics of diagnosis. People will often be diagnosed with PTSD, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder. You and Laura both reject the notion of Palestinians being viewed as traumatized victims of war or conflict, despite the profound suffering the Israeli state inflicts on Palestinians. Could you tell us a little bit more about this view?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you.
We can't hear you, I think. Is the sound?
Oh, you can't hear me. Can I?
Very softly.
Let me check. Is it better now? Can you hear me better now?
Thank you.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Elsie, for convening this meeting, and congratulations for the Dutch Palestine Global Mental Health branch, and that this is the first event, and we're very proud that the network is expanding and the Dutch branch has started with this event. So thank you. If you allow me, I would like also to add a little bit about the previous question before I tackle this one, if you don't mind.
For sure.
Like, yeah. Two things. One thing is that, for example, I want to give an example that you're in your clinic, in your practice, and someone comes to you late because they were held on the checkpoint. Because now the checkpoints would keep people 2 to 3 hours at least on the way coming from home to the clinic, for example, if they're crossing any checkpoint. Like, for example, if you're crossing from a suburb of Jerusalem called Kufr Aqab into Jerusalem, you have to pass by a checkpoint. And you can be held there for hours. And even if you go by the bypass road, that bypass road is closed at certain hours only to allow settlers. So if you happen to be at that checkpoint at a certain time, then that checkpoint is completely closed because it has to allow the settlers to move and the Palestinians have to wait. So the patient comes to your practice late, very angry, aggressive. Do you see that as being a resistance to you as a practitioner, or do you also take it in the context? Can you, can I, as a Palestinian, divorce myself from that situation and not see and feel what he has or she has been going through in order to come to my practice, or feel that the reality has been imposed on our practice, and it's not only the patient and myself. The whole reality, the whole surrounding, the whole environment, the occupation, the colonialism, the apartheid is there in our relationship. It's very present, and we have to deal with it. I'm not going to look at my patient as someone who's resisting me or that he is an aggressive person. I'm going to look at this person as someone who had gone through a lot of pains to be with me, and to also feel that we have to bring this experience into our relationship. And I will be moved because I am living that reality, because I, as a Palestinian practitioner working in the old city, has to go through also the same situation on a daily basis, where I go through the old city and I see all the time how the children and the young people are stopped by the soldiers and searched and harassed and humiliated. And I myself is stopped on many occasions just because I stand there and ask, why are you doing that? And I'm pushed and I'm not allowed to go into the old city. So all of that is there. I'm a subject, I'm an object, but I am both in that situation. So this is what we're talking about. So when I'm going through all of that, do I pathologize or I look at the context? Do I see myself as someone who is just there to process those feelings, or I need to also work and be active in stopping that wound from being all the time open and bleeding all the time? Do I stand there, like, again, you asked about Fanan, and Fanan, like, posed that question on us, mental health workers. Do we see ourselves do we uphold moral values when we see something happening and we don't do anything to stop it? Do we accept that? Do we accept that we are really mental health workers if we don't stop the suffering? And that's, I think, is a very important question. Do I just sit there and say, I'm a professional, I don't work in politics, or is it this is a defense and this is hiding away from, really confronting myself and my obligations and my responsibilities towards humanity and towards decolonization, decolonialism, and also against, if you like, apartheid and racial segregation. This is a very important issue that every one of us has also to face, because this is an obligation. If I am really looking at myself as a psychologist, and I'm really looking at my myself as a human being, I have to ask these questions of myself. And I have to ask myself, what kind of human being am I? Am I someone who just believes that I can preach but not practice? Or I'm someone who believes that in order to really make things happen, to really work in healing, I have to also be there and to look at the causes and not just the symptoms. So I think that this is very important issues that we confront, and we have been also, like Lara was saying, we have been informed by revolutionaries like Fanon, like our friend Al-Araj, who have practiced themselves, and they have told us that this is the way that this happens, and that I cannot just be a witness and observer and looking at the situation and not doing anything to stop the pain and the suffering, and to also look at my own racism. And I think that this is something that I have to examine very much also as a practitioner. Do I see that I am holding higher status as a professional because I'm not engaged actively in my patients' concerns? Because that is also superiority, and that is also, in a way, racism, because I'm not really able to really connect with the realities of my profession. Okay, that for the first issue. But for your question about trauma, looking at my way of looking at it, and also a lot of Palestinian practitioners and theoreticians and academicians, we have come to a conclusion that PTSD, in its, if you like, delineating symptoms or talking about the definition of PTSD, does not actually hold true, or it does not relate very well to the Palestinian situation, because there is no pause in our situation. First off, we are living in a, if you like, continuous and in a complex. It's a continuous and complex traumas. Like, for example, if you're talking about Gaza now, what is the most traumatic event or issue for the child? The losing of the parent, the losing of the house, the shock and awe, the continuous fear, the destruction of the community, the famine and the starvation, the lack of water, the lack of security. What is the most traumatic issue there? So we're not talking about like a single event. We're not talking about a post event. We are living in a continuous and complex trauma. And if you like, you know, what we have been witnessing now in Gaza is a repetition and recurrence of the Nakba. So whatever, I mean, and this says that we as Palestinians, since the Nakba, have been going through a trauma, one trauma after the other. And so what now we have been seeing in Gaza is that the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the criminalities is only a repetition of what happened in 1948. And what we are seeing now is what we have been told, Subhi, by our ancestors, by our grandmothers, and by our mothers and fathers who lived through the Nakba, that they had to leave their homes were destroyed, they were witnessing the killing of their loved ones, then the gangs. I mean, the Israeli army is still the same gangs as the Haganah, and I mean, nothing changed. They still kill. And imagine, only today, just before I joined the meeting, there was this piece of news that in Rafah, now that Rafah is totally occupied, that in Rafah, the soldiers are enjoying their time using the quadcopter to kill the people who are living in the tents. They are doing it as a game. So they're playing with their quadcopters and killing. So in that sense, again, I go back to the issue. It's not post, it's complex, and it is continuous and it's recurrent. And also, PTSD assumes that the person is actually, there is a pathologization of the issue. But what we are seeing in Palestine is that it is very much a political issue. It's not that the person has to be treated in a pathologic way, as a pathologically inflicted person, because the person's reaction is a normal reaction to a very abnormal situation. So the pathologization is not there. And also, if we look at PTSD and we want to react to it in a medical and, if you like, a biomedical or psychological way, then we are pathologizing an issue which requires that we deal with it in a very different way. We have to deal with it in rebuilding, in making a house, and not looking at the person individually and not looking at the building of the community, because the building of the community is what will help heal the person. The situation is what will help deal with the person. So if I use PTSD, then I'm individualizing the problem and thinking that I will deal with it by having that person come to therapy or take medications, and this is how I deal with the situation. But in our situation, this is not how I deal with the situation. The way that I deal with the situation is to end this colonial settler regime, is to fight it, is to end the atrocities, is to name things by their real name, and to call those who are committing the genocide and the atrocities criminals, because that will help the healing, because the person did not imagine what happened. It happened. And those are criminals who are systematically and intentionally targeting the people to cause the shock and awe. So if I want to deal with it, if I want to work as a mental health professional, I have to also look on how I call things by their real name and how I fight it. I have to work, I have to engage in fighting the cause that has been happening, that has caused this recurrent and complex trauma for the Palestinian, and not the individual who is traumatized.
Thank you. Sam, I'm looking at you.
Yeah.
In Dutch mental health, we're used to individualizing mental health problems and diagnosing social and structural problems. How do you look at changing that in the Netherlands?
It was a tough question. First of all, thanks for inviting me. I was telling Donna I was waiting for 8 months for having this discussion with colleagues. I also see a lot of colleagues in the room, so it's very nice. I can maybe tackle the question by also highlighting a few things the esteemed speakers before me just said. First of all, I think the problem with our profession is not professionals. It's much more systemic. I think clinical psychology, and I think I may also include psychiatry, we have a fundamental problem in addressing social and political determinants of suffering in general. I don't want to say mental health problems because that's also a frame. Suffering, and I think in the Netherlands, psychiatry and clinical psychology is also failing Dutch native patients from a marginalized background, let alone Palestinians who has experienced Nakba or genocide. And I think part of the problem is that psychology and psychiatry, they claim to be apolitical, but they're actually very political. I think there are systems or practices of neoliberalism, and I'm just going to explain it in a second, because I think clinical psychology, as we practice it in Holland and elsewhere, I think is best viewed as a form of ethnopsychology, which means as a form of psychology, understanding of human minds and how it interacts with the environment that is deeply based and rooted in European and American cultural values. And if you look at historically how clinical psychology came into being in the 19th century and further development in the 20th century, it was around the same time that capitalism, gained ground, and also neoliberalism. And you see a lot of these values and systems of thought also in the way we theorize about human functioning and psychological functioning. For example, the idea that basically success or failure are mostly defined by your own individual merits, regardless of the context. The kind of extreme idea that we see in American dream. Basically, it doesn't matter what are your life conditions or where you're from. As long as you can just change yourself and do your best, you can achieve everything you want. Now, we see that kind of norms and values reflected in the way we conduct psychotherapy by focusing only on the individual experience of a person, neglecting the entire political, social context that led to that experience of suffering. Or the idea that progress, economical progress or social progress is mainly dependent on competition, which leads to concentration of power and capital in certain areas, and that system needs to be preserved and maintained because that's how the neoliberal system works. You see it also in the way we actually tend to neglect the political context and the social context in the way we diagnose mental health problems, because that medicalization that I think was previously pointed to is not a politically neutral act. You frame something as something medical, not as something as a result of political or social issues. And when you frame it as a medical problem, the solution will also become medical. So it becomes medication or parts of psychotherapy that completely neglect the whole political and social context. So I do believe that certain forms of medicalization and psychotherapy, well-intended, are very harmful to the patients who have experienced political violence. And I have also a fundamental issue with PTSD as applied to a lot of our patients with a refugee background, experience of social inequalities or political violence, because for the same reason as I said, you transform, you medicalize something that is, by definition, not medical. And your question was how you can change that. I don't know. I think we need we need discussions like this, and we need also to gradually reevaluate how we relate to the experiences of our patients and the societal dynamics that are very influential for the suffering that we see. Yeah, I also believe in structures. So I don't think I will see a fundamental change in clinical psychology in my lifetime. We need a complete cultural change for that.
Okay. Well, let's build it then together. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think one way to counter pathologization, it is a difficult word, Hannah, or it looks like a political solution, is peace-building activities, which is often promoted by international NGOs in Palestine. Rana, you have for some time engaged in peace-building activities, and Lara, you wrote about this in your book and Rana's experiences with peace-building activities, and you framed or you mentioned it that it's not only stealing the land and identity of Palestinians, but you're also stealing the pain of Palestinians by promoting these peace-building campaigns. Could you share a little bit more about that, both of you?
تفضلي حبيبتي، بدك تحكي أنت بالأول؟
I will start with a story. What stopped me, and that was in the 90s. And I think I shared that with you, Laura. In the 90s, we had this illusion that, yes, it's possible. Maybe there is misunderstanding. The problem here is that we are very stuck to our discourse and narrative, and that each one has to listen to the other narrative. It was so naive. It was really naive. And it was also, for us Palestinian, if you like, masochistic. Because you are the one who is living in a situation where there is a colonial regime taking everything from you, taking the land, taking the resources, and taking away your culture, and also, like attacking your psyche all the time, because all the time you had to prove that you're not the person who is aggressed against. You are the ones who has to prove that you are not aggressive and that you are not going to hurt the other. And the thing is that the other had to apologize for what they've done to you. They never did. And they had to also talk about their aggression, which they never did. Because you, as the Palestinian who is sitting in that room, for example, had to show that you are a passive, nice, inferior, if you like, the house slave who is very, tamed, and it's not going to be in any way, if you like, hurtful for the Jews, Jewish Israelis to live beside. So this is the masochistic aspect. So one time in the 90s, there was a group of young people meeting, and the meeting was between Palestinian youth and the group from Meretz, which is at that time was a left organization, what they called a left party. So there was this engagement and they talked, and at the end of the meeting, one of the Palestinian guys, went to this Israeli young man and he slapped him on the back and said, whatever you are, now we're friends. When I see you in the checkpoint, you will take care of me. And the guy looked at him and he said, what? The minute we go out of this room, I am the soldier and you are the Palestinian who is going to go through the checkpoint and go through the process of being a suspect, and that I will be, considering you as such. That was one story. That was like, a reality check. It just hit me in the face. The other was a group of mental health workers, if you like, clinicians, Palestinian and Israelis, who we met a few times, again in the 90s, and supposedly we were negotiating having a organization of Palestinian and Israeli mental health workers. And it was supposed to be called the Bridge, something like that. Anyway, so we said, some of us in the Palestinian group, we said, to start, a very important start for us to go forward is to have you, as the Israeli psychologist, apologize for what Israel did to us in 1948. Because that would be the most important and fundamental start point. And they said, no, we will not apologize, because supposedly, if we apologize, we are actually denying our right to be there, because we are admitting that we wronged you. They know, but they don't want to admit that they wronged us. They don't want to admit that there was crimes committed and that there were houses that were stolen. And maybe some of them are actually living in those houses that were taken away from the Palestinians, whether this is in Haifa or in Karem or name it. So what are we talking about? When the reality on the ground is saying that we live in a situation where there is an oppressive, people belonging to this oppressive regime, and they are part of it, and they are part of this colonial settler state, which is taking everything from the Palestinian on every aspect of their life, and there are the oppressed, and those people who are living the reality in their life where every aspect of their life is actually violated. Every aspect of their life is violated. And that this is a situation where no peace can happen. No peace can happen. There is no way to talk about peace when the whole situation, and we are seeing that now, we are seeing that the whole society is actually, if you like, mobilized towards hatred and not accepting the existence of us Palestinians. What peace are we talking about? I'm sure everyone is hearing how the Israelis and the latest poll said that 50% of the Israelis or more wants complete annexation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and that they do not believe that there should be a Palestinian state, for example. So what kind of peace, when we have seen that also on the level of negotiation, if you like, on the political level, nothing has happened, nothing since 1996, 1993, 96, with the Oslo Agreement, except the expansion of settlements, the grabbing of more land, the more atrocities committed, more destruction of homes, more checkpoints, more like system of apartheid happening in Palestine, where again, like I told you, we have to take different roads. The settlers have to, now if you look at the road from Ramallah to Nablus, for example, you see all the land of the villagers have been taken in order to have a safe highway for the settlers. So the realities on the ground are telling us that the peace, these, if you like, these, so-called normalization or peace building issues is nothing but propaganda. And it's been very much encouraged, unfortunately, by the Europeans, because for all they care about, whether it is the EU or other European countries, including the Dutch, unfortunately, all they care about is like, oh, we've done our peace and we are helping them sit together. And everybody knows that this is not the situation. The situation is that you have to look at your responsibility for removing the main cause for the lack of peace. And that is the Israeli colonialism and Israeli occupation of the Palestinian. And when I say occupation, I'm saying occupation and occupying every aspect of our life. So this is what has to be dealt with. And then, again, like in South Africa, reconciliation, when there is an end to this situation, then we can talk about the possibility of reconciliation. But you cannot talk about it now. Now it is basically talking to the Palestinians and victimizing them over and over again, because again, what you want them, and this is unfortunately what we see in Europe, Europeans want the Palestinians to be the house slaves, that we are dependent, like Fanon says, we are dependent, and out of our dependency, we become inferior. And when we are inferior, we accept everything that is imposed on us. And again, this is by no chance possible, and that does not bring peace. That's not peace building.
Thank you so much. Which brings me to the next question, Lara, that I want to ask you. Another way to actually look at improving the situation, improving mental health, would be resistance. You've mentioned resistance as a way to counter pathologization. And there's also been talk about the therapeutic potential of the global protest and solidarity movement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I'm thankful to Rana for, sharing personal stories, because I think for me, and in segueing into that answer, is What I want to highlight, and I'm very interested in always, are the psychic maneuvers that structural oppressive regimes, power, let's say, engage in to create confusion, to deflect, to make us answer questions that move us off the target, right? And so I want to name this idea of peace building as a way to move into why resistance is important and the varying forms of resistance. When you bring peace building as the starting point, one of the things you bank on as a power is selective amnesia about all the steps that have already been taken, right? And why I'm grateful to Rana for starting us off is because here's somebody who's telling you, look at all these things we actually did in good faith. By the time somebody gets to the point to engage in a psychic refusal, which is what we talk a lot about in our book, right, are the ways that people refuse any more intrusions, requests or demands for submission, because power doesn't, power's not cute. It's not coming along and being like, hey, I'll give you a little bit if you just give me a little bit. It asks for full submission. There is no way, because if we believe what Fanon was telling us, that colonialism, and here we can add settler colonialism, is not a thinking machine, but is actually invested in its longevity. This is why constitutively, as a mark of its being, it cannot have anything less than submission. In the same ways that a settler cannot exist if an indigenous is present, because that is contradictory to the longevity of a settler colonial project. It must actually replace the indigenous and involve all of us in reworking history psychically to say it's actually the settler that's the native, and it's the native that's the intruder, right? Of course, this is Patrick Wolf's idea, but this is a version of what's happening. And so peace building efforts right now, especially, I want us to think about, if we're thinking about logics, about the way power works in logics, there is something so incredibly violent. And I want to name it. When Rana says name things as they are, when Fanon tells us to have militant clarity and truth-telling, it's because violent systems depend on us not naming the process that it's happening for them to continue as they are. Nothing gets disrupted if we're not acknowledging, and if we hide in modes of innocence, which settler colonialism and capitalism and imperialism all work on. So the starting point is to say that at this moment, reaching to peace-building efforts is a perverse, violent act that fundamentally subordinates and says that a Palestinian must submit to their death at the hands of a genocidal apartheid settler colonial regime. Otherwise, they are not legible as humans. They must give up all claims to sovereignty before they can even be accepted into a conversation, right? We have to be clear about that. That is what we're saying. Now, the cynic, I'm always attuned to the cynic or the violent, ear that would say, oh, so you don't want peace? That's the answer. No, the answer is that we are clear on what is causing an upheaval. And once we are clear on that, we are better positioned to move ourselves to what we understand will disrupt the mechanism of violence, right? That is a refusal. It is a refusal to accept the conditions upon which this idea of peace has been built to begin with. Because for us to think that peace is also neutral, I mean, we all live, I'm in the United States, you all are in the Netherlands. We are part of a settler colonial machinery that has a history of colonialism and empire. And peace building efforts are not neutral either. We need to be honest about what that means. That is why it's the militant sort of truth-telling around this, around what it means to demand peace in conditions that are fundamentally not natural. These are not natural conditions, right? It would be the same. Let me give a concrete example. We can look at the United States and say, and laugh, and think it's absurd to think that the United States can still say that it is invested in peace when just last week we saw it use a peer to Trojan horse humanitarian aid and inflict a massacre on people in a so-called safe zone, right? That's the parallel we're talking about. If we see logics repeat themselves, in the same breath, the United States can convince everybody it's still interested in peace, while flagrantly committing war crimes, we should be suspect of anything that defends itself with that word peace in this current global climate, because peace comes with conditions. And those conditions, as Rana is telling us, include psychologically subordinating oneself to become legible to the person who's causing the harm to begin with, right? This, I think, links also into the trauma question. Part of the reason why we resist that is because to be trauma, and folks who will work with refugees know this, is that you must become a traumatized subject without a traumatizer. You're not allowed to name what caused the trauma. You're not allowed to say, I'm here on refugee status because I'm a Palestinian child whose parents were murdered during a genocide in Gaza, supported by the global powers. I suddenly become an unaccompanied child. That becomes the legal term. That's the political aspect that we're talking about here. And that's what I mean about peace. To wager peace, you must give up parts of yourself. And that is already a violence that is being done to you. And so to think that it's the people whose violence is already being done to even sit at the table, that they're the ones who are saying they don't want peace, is a violent act on our part. And it's a perverse act, and we have to name that. This is why this is the segue into resistance. The very act of saying, I refuse to accept the conditions of my oppressor, that is an act of resistance. Oftentimes people will think resistance is just picking up arms. That might be part of it. It's one of many ways that we have seen in history. Fanon was a gun runner for the Algerian Revolution. We can't say that any revolution in the history of the world has been won without armed resistance as a part of it. But to be cynical to say that is the only thing we are talking about when we are talking about resistance is to parrot the propaganda of oppressors. Because there is nothing that scares people more than the psychic associative process when you say, this, by the way, the terrorist trope is already made, right? When we say armed resistance bad, that doesn't exist in a vacuum. We say armed resistance bad, and we rely on you all to already have the imaginary fantasy of who that person holding the gun is. Even while we're seeing in plain sight who is actually holding the guns, who is actually holding in the helicopters, who is actually bombing refugees. At the same time we're seeing that, our imaginaries already go to an already made terrorist. That terrorist right now happens to be a Palestinian, happens to be an Arab, but we know history enough to know it was once a South African, it was once a Vietnamese person, it was once an indigenous person, whether that's in New Zealand or Canada or Australia or so-called United States, right? Those refusals, the refusal to succumb to amnesia, the refusal to say, I'm going to just lay down and die, the refusal to engage in settler colonial reversals that would say somehow everybody has the right to protect their land except the indigenous person. That is settler colonial reality bending. So those are all examples of refusals. A refusal also might be to not work with clinicians who still are silent about this, who still have a both sides idea and think that they are being ethical. That is also a refusal. That is also resistance. What we see in the streets, what we see from students, whether it's in the context of the United States or in Europe, right? That is an idea of, that is what we're seeing, resistance in real time. And so it demands that we expand our idea of what resistance means and what resistance is about. That fundamentally, resistance is about pushing up against the seams of everything that has been told to us is normative. And when we resist, we say, no, this is a construction, and it's a construction that supports and stabilizes an oppressive regime of being. When we see Dutch students in the streets protesting, and we see the state come down with all its violence and all its oppression, we've watched the videos, right? There's a truth-telling that's being told. Why would the state need to be mobilized that quickly and with such ferocity if those students out there weren't actually fundamentally telling a truth just by being there? Saying, we refuse. We refuse this violence. We refuse to have it being done in our name. We refuse the innocence of the state and saying it has nothing to do with this. We refuse the borders that say because it's happening in Gaza, it doesn't mean anything to us. We absolutely, that's a part of resistance. And that's a psychological process. It's a psychological process to divest from individualism. That's a part of resistance too, is to say what happens in Gaza directly affects me, whether I'm Palestinian or not, right? And resisting the idea that somehow because I'm in Amsterdam, I have nothing to do with that Palestinian in Gaza, in Ramallah, in Nablus, in Jerusalem, in Haifa, everywhere else. That is a mode of resistance. And it's our job as clinicians also to join people in that.
Yeah.
Twee tellen. Ik moet even de microfoon naar je brengen voor de opname.
Ja, nee,
Twee tellen.
Ja, dankjewel. Nee, ik ben gewoon even tussendoor heel erg nieuwsgierig naar wat jullie doel is van vanavond. Wat willen jullie ons precies meegeven? Ik heb denk ik vooral een hele andere voorstelling gehad van wat er nu besproken wordt.
Okay.
Want veel van de dingen die ik hoor, vind ik super interessant trouwens. Maar ik was er al van overtuigd. Ik hoef er niet opnieuw van overtuigd te raken. Maar ik zit hierin in mijn rol als psycholoog vooral met het idee, wat kan ik als psycholoog nou anders doen? En ik merk dat ik niet helemaal aansluiting vind in de verhalen. Dus misschien heb ik gewoon het doel van de avond verkeerd begrepen. Dus zou je dat misschien nog even kunnen toelichten voor mij, of ik hier op mijn plek zit of niet?
And maybe translate for the speakers, because this was in Dutch.
Yeah, she just asked like what the goal of tonight was, and because she's still questioning what she can do personally as a mental health professional to help the Palestinian cause. Am I translating that correct? Okay. Well, there's still some questions that I would like to ask the speakers, so we're not finished yet. But I understand that it's still maybe not practical tips enough. Am I correct? Okay.
So for me, it's very much, it goes about how badly the situation is for Palestinians, and I totally agree with that. But I already agreed with that. For me, I definitely was looking for more something practical, like you say, like what can I do? Like, okay, some questions have been asked, what you should ask yourself as a psychologist when you speak to a client. But I just feel confused at this moment. Like, what should I do? I feel a little bit clueless, I guess. So that's why I was wondering, like, am I gonna get my answers, or not? Yeah.
Well, maybe can we wait to see if you get your answers by the end of the panel discussion, in case you
I have something to say on
Okay,
that towards the end. I think there are other colleagues also who can add to it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I think one important thing is what Lara just mentioned, is the importance of resistance and refusal to take part in the system. Am I saying that correctly, Lara? Is there anything you want to add by this intermezzo question? Okay.
At this point, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I'm always baffled by the issue of what can I do, because I think that this is something that each one of us has to answer once they understand what their capacities is, what they are capable of doing. And I think that can go from political activism to being active in the streets, to objecting, to calling for, to working also on every level, whether it is in the, like awareness raising or activism or being or calling things by their name, by also looking at why is Europe, for example, and Holland, for example, why is it tolerant to this criminality? And I think this is a very important issue that we have to ask ourselves. Why is there, like regimes that claim that they uphold international, principles and values and so on, and they are tolerant of this criminality that is happening to Israel, and they're not accepting to have any kind of sanctions imposed on Israel, which is the least that can be done, is to call for sanctions, to call for complete boycott and sanctions of Israel as being a rogue state and also a criminal state. By being in Holland, to also be part of asking for the the court to criminalize those who are also committing these crimes. I mean, this is a lot. And I think by engaging in what is now, the event, which is the global, the Palestine Dutch Global Mental Health Network, because through it, there is a lot of issues that can be done on the advocacy level, on the awareness raising level, on the activism level. So being part, because I do believe, that one of the main problems that led the world to be there is less activism in the world is that kind of, individualizing ourselves, to look at ourselves as only one person and thinking in all this complexity of the problems in the world, how can I make a difference as an individual? And that is the problem, because, the main importance is in really making things happen. Of course, first of all is realizing our role, but then second, to be part of a movement, to be part of a group, and to look at things in general, and not to compartmentalize ourselves in one thing or the other, that it has to be mental health, or it has to be women, or it has to be feminism, because all of them are related. Like, for example, I had a discussion the other day with a woman from UNFPA who came to talk about gender-based violence. And I said, how can we talk about gender-based violence without talking about militarization in the world? The militarization and also upholding values like might is right is what is causing violence and is causing gender-based violence, and it is giving, it's fueling that type of violence, whether it is domestic or in the street or in every aspect of our life. We cannot take one thing and say that only by dealing with that we are making a difference. No, if we do not look at the thing in a global way, we can act in a specific way, but we have to analyze in a global way. We have to connect the imperialism with colonialism, with militarization, with all these aspects, and to look at them as being, if you like, the enemies of humanity. And if we do not deal with those enemies of humanity, every issue that we deal with would be just, like putting a band-aid on an open wound. We have to analyze in a global way, but again, look at things that we are capable of doing and channeling our energy in that aspect. So, for example, you know, like
sorry, I'm gonna cut you off, Rana.
sorry.
But I think it's the message is clear that our work doesn't end after we close the door of our clinical setting, and that we have to be activists, join the BDS movement, etc. Sam, I want to pose a question to you, which is more related to what we can do in the clinical setting with our patients. Because your work is to provide culturally sensitive mental health care to migrants and refugees. And many professionals in the field have been trained in evidence-based manualized treatments that are often based on cognitive behavioral techniques. And these treatments are client-centered, are apolitical. So what would be your advice for professionals to take into account the historical and political context within the treatment settings?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe for the sake of time, I'll be brief because I think a lot of things have been said that are also relevant for the answer to this question. I think it would be nice for clinicians to engage in a form of anthropology, not of the patient, but our own culture. Because as we just discussed, there is a lot of cultural biases and assumptions that we tend to reproduce in the way we practice psychotherapy, and being mindful of those elements makes you also much more mindful and attentive to the needs and background of the patient. So for the individual clinicians, I think it's very good to engage in a kind of a critical reappraisal of clinical psychology and psychotherapy. There is a lot of literature on that. But I think also in terms of policy, we do have I think in medicine and in psychology, philosophy of science, but I would also want to advocate for sociology or anthropology of science, because this whole discussion we have tonight is about, having a critical sociological view of what we're doing as clinicians. And I think one more important thing is, and I come back to Fanon because I think he's the star of the evening now, having an eye for violence. And let me explain what I mean by that, because typically we're trained to recognize violence in a physical way, like the IDF or Hamas violence. But there is also a lot of covert implicit violence that is actually more damaging. And I'm talking about the violence of colonialism, even when it's peaceful, quotation marks, but also violence of complicity of the system of clinical psychology, psychotherapy, as we talked about, but also our societies. And I think coming back to the points raised by Rana and Lara, engaging in advocacy in different ways, I think is fundamental to practicing clinical psychology in this era. Maybe more than at the time of Fanon. And that was a time of decolonization movements, right? Because I think there is a much more silencing going on. Maybe you can talk about that later, about your research. I'm very curious on that. So it means it takes much more effort on part of critical clinicians to engage in that kind of advocacy. And it can be talking with your colleagues about what is important, having a critical appraisal or evaluation, coming to these kind of meetings, or going on the street. There are different forms of engaging in decoloniality and critical thinking. In terms of doing practical clinical work, I'm very much in favor of CBT and trauma treatments and other approaches, but I think it's fundamental to have a differentiation or a different understanding of the predicaments of, for example, a Palestinian from Gaza that has suffered historical trauma of Nakba and the current genocide, and a survivor of an accident on the Ring of Amsterdam. According to our professional guidelines, we treat them both the same way. And that's mad, that's bizarre. And we need to really re-engage in a kind of a critical reappraisal and reevaluation of how we recognize the historical pain and social, political violence that most of our patients from a refugee background are a victim of. So I think briefly, I would say these are maybe things that we should reconsider. And in terms of what you do, I think it's much more important to engage in a kind of, what kind of attitude do I need to have to engage in anti-colonial action? I think attitude comes first and then action. That's for me an adequate kind of an order in matters. Thank you. Yeah.
And you mentioned your research, Donna, which I would like to ask you about now, because you are doing research on the experience of talking about the topic of Palestine and Israel within mental health institutions. Can you share a little bit about the results so far and what you've been doing?
Yes, I'd like to do that. First, I'd also like to add to Samrat's...
I think your microphone needs...
My microphone needs to be tilted like this.
Yes.
Is that better? Thank you. I'd like to add on the subject that Sam just spoke about the way we treat patients with a minority background, that I think are what we do as therapists is trying to make people make sense of the way they were raised, the way they live, and the way they cope with life at this moment. And this is more than how your parents treated you, but it's quite often only brought down to this. And actually the whole societal system is really important to understand why you have certain strengths and certain vulnerabilities. And I think you as a psychiatrist or a psychologist have to be acutely aware of the social political surroundings that you work in. I had a patient, a black woman, that came to me for medication. I'm a psychiatrist. And when I was in a team meeting, one of the white colleagues told me that this lady was so happy to have had a black female psychiatrist and not a white man. And she asked herself, perhaps this patient has had traumatic experiences with white men. And I think this is so apolitical and so not having any idea about the social political background of patients. And I wonder if you can even treat black patients if you don't understand this, and if you were going to ask somebody, did you have a traumatic, like a real traumatic experience? And I think it would be a bit like, well, perhaps in a more less grief way, really not understanding somebody's position in society. And I think that's harmful. And I think that's pathologizing the person in ways going through their lives. So that's what I still wanted to add on, that you cannot be apolitical or have no idea on positionality of people. Then I'll go to my research. I'm doing a PhD on inclusion and identity in psychiatry, and I did a research on inclusion of psychiatrists in training from several minority backgrounds, so either migration, but also sexual background or class background, and how they felt that they fitted in the training, the residencies for psychiatrists. And actually, the main conclusion was that assimilation is the way that we treat difference. That we, as a profession, are quite welcome to all the differences, that everybody can have the same chances in becoming things. Well, I don't even agree with that, but don't talk about the differences, because then it gets really difficult. So you can be part of the group, but you can't talk about things that you think about differently than the norm. And then I was thinking about further research, and then came 7 October and everything else, and it really brought questions to mind about who's part of it, who is not, who is safe, who's not, which stories are being told and which stories are not. Because I myself felt very emotionally touched by everything that happened, angry, sad, confused, unsafe as well, especially with our really right-wing government that just was elected. But I felt no way of getting support on the work floor, because there was this kind of cramp around the whole subject. And I thought it would be really interesting to look at the way the talk about Israel-Gaza is being not had at the work floor, I think, and how that influences the sense of inclusion of residents that feel touched by the subject. So I put out a question to all the residents in the Greater Amsterdam area. If you feel touched by this subject, do you want me to interview you? I interviewed 7 people. And interestingly enough, most people that reacted had some kind of minority or migration background. Not all Islamic, but I think there's this kind of oppression that makes you more, how do you say, sensitive to oppressions of others. And also many of the respondents said that they were already before the 7th of October involved in solidarity or touched by the Palestinian cause. But they had many instances, mainly also ones who had a Muslim background, where they were already silenced about the Palestinian cause or been told kind of in different ways that it's not a subject on the work floor. And actually that Holland is pro-Israel. That's what a lot of my respondents said. So that's like the sense they feel on the work floor, that might be what people think, but nobody's really clear about that. And so the people that spoke to me were very emotionally touched by the subject, but that was also one of the inclusion criteria. So that's kind of, we knew we were going to find that. But they didn't talk about it a lot at the work floor. And as reasons not to talk about it, that's one of the things I found in the qualitative study, is one of them was fear to be seen as a terrorist or an extremist or as anti-Semitic, or fear to underline one's own position as a foreigner. I have a quote that I'd like to repeat. I think I'd be afraid that I would get some kind of stigma, the kind of stigma of a foreigner, that people would put me in a box again, that they would think I'm Islamic while I'm not. Just so many vooroordelen.
Prejudice.
Thank you. That I just wouldn't be seen as one of the residents, like a resident with ambition or with value. So that's one of the things that keep people from speaking up, because they feel very much put in a box and afraid of being seen differently. There's fear of professional backlash. It's seen as a holy house. I don't know if this is an English word, but it's something we are not allowed to talk about or to criticize. Otherwise, it would be what? A sacred space. And people are also really afraid of losing connection with other people if they would find out that they would have a different opinion. Because people are so touched that they're like, one person says, I don't want this confrontation. I don't want to have to explain to people what humanity is, what humane is. I don't want to explain that to my colleagues. Or that they don't want to, but because of this system of not talking about it, there's also alliances not being made, and people feel really isolated and also sometimes a bit paranoid about what people think, or am I alone, am I not alone? A good thing is that there seems to be a lot more talk going on, especially more than for 7th of October, but people are opening the floor a bit more to talk about this. What I might find is that it's more the left-winged white people that feel safe to talk about it, and then the people with a migration background add in, but because they've been silenced so much before that they don't feel safe in talking about it, or for the reasons I spoke about before. And often, of course, it's stopped by saying it's complicated, or let's not polarize. But I think not talking about it, I don't know if it doesn't polarize, because it's really difficult to talk about it. I wouldn't say we all become Hakuna Matata when we do talk about it. But I do think that you can find the people that you can relate to and understand your own pain a bit better and find connections that you need. I saw a hand somewhere. Was that? Yeah? I don't know if I can do that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. I have 2 more things I'd like to... topics I found. One topic is institutional trust. That's much lower, that people, I think we all realize this, even people already had quite eroded institutional trust, might even have found it eroded even more with how the international community and our leaders and deal with this situation. And then I asked people, how do you think your organization, so your mental health institution, should speak up? And in the beginning they say, nah, I don't think so that they should, they're neutral. And but then they do have this rainbow flag, and they did say something about Ukraine, so why not? And I would really appreciate it if my organization would say something, because I would feel more connected. And they hold the same values as I do. And in the end, also one of the respondents said, that this doesn't happen does make me doubt if I want to be a psychiatrist when I finish my residency in this place, because the values I hold high and my institution holds high are so different. So there's this really silent, because all these voices are so silenced. There's this really silent quitting of a group seems to be going on because there is so little support and so little talk about it. One last thing I'd like to say about this is that I found very interesting. Some people worked with Jewish patients also during this period. And there were 2 people that had this, so I can't say about the scientific weight of this, but they said that they didn't have a problem treating the people that felt very unsafe in this treatment setting with patient therapists. One person said, twice I thought, okay, this is an Israeli patient. Would this person want to have me, somebody with a Muslim background that also wore a veil, want to have me as somebody who will treat him, or will he or she make a point of it, not want to be treated by me? But both times it didn't happen. So also the Jewish patient didn't not want a Muslim therapist, and actually the co-working, the therapeutic relationship went quite okay, which I found really touching, that there's such a big polarization on this bigger level, but then in the clinic, when it's about human relationships, sometimes actually it can work out. Sometimes I don't think it's only Hakuna Matata as well here, but I found it quite touching to hear this. So that's the first results I have for now from the people I interviewed.
Thank you.
Yep.
I think I have a similar experience where, as I mentioned, I'm working on a team for asylum seekers, and even we had a Palestinian family come for treatment, and I was just discussing what's going on, and they're actually from Gaza originally. So I was discussing the situation in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, with colleagues, and then it kind of went quiet, a little uncomfortable, and they said, yeah, the Israelis are having a hard time too. And then I just decided to stay quiet for a bit. But yeah, it's really uncomfortable. Like, you want to be able for it to be a safe space to talk about it. And especially there's some, I think, expectations for fellow mental health professionals to look at things from a similar point of view. And when that turns out not to be true, then
there's lots of quotes also labeled under losing faith in colleagues or losing connection with colleagues or this.
Yeah. So now I would like to give space for questions from the audience. If you could raise your hand, and then a microphone will come to you.
Could I answer the first question that there was a first question already. Is it all right if I said it?
Definitely. You mean about what we can do practically as mental health professionals to help? Yeah, sure.
I wanted to, I'm appreciative of the opportunity to highlight that I'm not speaking abstractly when I say these things. And so what I mean by this is, when we say, truth tell, oftentimes with class issues, when we're talking as Marxists, we say you have to be a class traitor. When we say about racism, we say you have to be a race traitor. If we're talking about white supremacy, and white folks are often like, what can I do? And it's like, you have to be a race traitor every day. I would invite us to be professional traitors. And what does that mean? It means, by what folks are saying, is that we have to recognize that our profession, it's called a discipline for a reason. It disciplines us into a particular way of thinking. And so my invitation when I speak, I'm not speaking abstractly. I am actually saying concretely. So what does that mean? It means that if I'm glad to hear that you're here because you already agree, right? But what does that mean? It means we show up everywhere as that clinician that agrees, not just as a person. If I show, it's to say I'm a clinician, and it's because of my expertise that I actually think clinicians have something to say on this, that we are not neutral. It means every time somebody does a maneuver that says we can't talk about genocide because it's going to hurt somebody's feelings, it's to be what Sarah Ahmed calls a feminist killjoy, and to say, no, this is genocide. Are you lobbying every organization you're a part of to be included in boycott, to not go to academic institutions? Every time an email is written that enacts violence that we know, small and big, is going to give cover for an apartheid genocidal regime, are we disrupting that? And are we disrupting that in the name of our ethical imperative as clinicians? I think that is what I mean by concretely truth-telling. That means there is no rest for us. It means that every time we show up, every day we get up and we say, I will not be a clinician that engages in innocence. I will not be a clinician that engages in neutrality. And when we do feel ourselves being like, oh, I don't want to disrupt this, this is just a conversation, or this is a listserv, or maybe it's not my fault, maybe it's not my place, is to push through that and say, no, it is my place. And at least I'm one person. And the number of times that you are that one person, whether it's on a listserv or in a space or in a talk, that says something and says, I am for Palestine because I'm a clinician and I'm here to disrupt the normativity that is happening right now. These processes happen very seamlessly. As to say, no, I'm here to say there's a person here that's for Palestine. I guarantee you there are 10, 15, 20 others that are either going to message you back channel or are going to feel like they can now speak because you do that. If you are somebody who's doing that every time, then fantastic. Then you're here just to lend support, to say, I'm here to lend support to this new organization. But if there are spaces in which we continue to use softer words, to not say then that's the place of action for us. And it's a place for us to say, no, we're clinicians, we have to stay in this lane. That's what it means to be an engaged clinician. To say part of being an engaged clinician means speaking through my expertise to say that is why our voices belong in this.
There's a question here.
Yes, I am really happy with what you said and also what you discussed here, Rana. Your name is
Me?
Lara
and Rania. Yeah. I work for the municipality as a coach, and in the past 8 months, I have been trying to disrupt the system. I have a lot of clients from Yemen, from Syria, Palestinian, Syrian, or Palestinians, who are in shock because of the reaction of the municipalities since this genocide started, and also because of the political context in the Netherlands. They feel so insecure, they feel so outraged, their mental health has been going backward, and they come to me with their questions, and I totally understand them, and I totally support them in my work and try to do as much as I can in order to support them mentally and emotionally. But there is no space to discuss this within the Gemeente. And I discussed it several times with the municipality, with my boss, and they all can say we cannot do anything about it. We cannot acknowledge their situation. We cannot acknowledge their struggle for freedom and in order to get more space within the public debate. So I am really happy that you said that we need to disrupt it, but we really have to disrupt. And if we want to address these people with the right tools, with the right treatment, we have to create space in order to listen to their voices and bring their voices forward. So this is the first time we can do as a responsible officers or psychologists in this regard. Thank you for organizing this space as well tonight.
And maybe to add something small to it as well, just as a citizen of Amsterdam that is engaged with this topic as well. And I really loved what the speaker said about, not making it clinic, but also part of resistance is that for me to be even able to exist healthy in Amsterdam, not as a Palestinian, but just as a human, I can only exist in Amsterdam because I'm in relationship with people who are resisting genocide. If I can't, I will not feel at home on this soil because I don't want to be part of a culture that normalizes genocide. So if you as a practitioner, what you said, you show up every time at the protest and this kind of thing, and when a patient comes to you, I can imagine you can maybe also refer them to communities that will not deny this reality. Because without these communities of protest, I would not be mentally healthy either, just as a human, because I don't want to be part of a genocidal culture. So thank you for sharing that. I want to go to you.
Yeah, I would like to add something from the patient side. Let's say, like I grew up in East Jerusalem and I lived there 30 years and I used to work in the West Bank and used to pass from checkpoints on a daily basis. And I moved to the Netherlands when I was 30. So when I came here, many times I felt that we are often pushed to the defensive directly, like when you say where you're from. You're often pushed to the defensive as anti-Semite, which is like totally not the case. And you're always like have to defend yourself and your narrative. And many times for me and some other Palestinians, it's very difficult to talk about politics. It's different than other people who just go to the demonstrations. And for me, like many times I was avoiding to talk about politics because for other people, it's like, they can just answer. But for me, I would go home and I would be weeping at night, remembering remembering people shot, remembering being stripped of my clothes on checkpoints, remembering so many things. And these kinds of, or airports and how I was treated, and even remembering like bomb attacks in West Jerusalem by Palestinians, right? Remembering shelling by Israelis and bomb attacks by Palestinians. And so it's not like we don't always have the luxury to talk like people they just ask and they ask. And for me, it's like sometimes I learned as a Palestinian to draw the boundary and say, today I'm not going to answer. Like it's because for people, it's just a question. But for me as a Palestinian, it's like I have to go home. And as a mom, then I have a lot of anxiety. And I think it's not so simple. It's not so simple. It's very complex what we feel. So you can't put all Palestinians in one box or all Arabs, and because every Palestinian deals with it in different ways. For me, what helped, I did NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and it was really tough. Like I had to remember everything and remember it again. And I think this process of when you go abroad and you're in a safe space, let's say, you're not away from the occupation. Like a lot of my friends, they tell me, oh, you're lucky, you're in Europe, you're safe. But for me, like at home, when it's totally silent, I used to get the first 3 years like flashbacks, continuous flashbacks. And this is tough to deal with. So I learned like how to deal with it, how of course, with the PTSS treatment, and so it helped me stop the flashbacks, but it's sometimes I feel speechless. So I just wanted to say that it's all so complicated, and it's always like here in the Netherlands, this image that there's two like Palestinians against the Israelis, and it's not like that. It's much more complex. It's a whole institution, it's a whole system, and it's very difficult. And sometimes you can't like also not necessarily someone from a southern background would understand the Palestinian better, because sometimes like a normal Dutch from a white background who has the awareness and the sensitivity, they can deal with it. I like to go beyond this projection into deeper, looking deeper. And the way also with Fanon, like maybe some Palestinians I've spoken here too, look up to Israelis. It's part also of the psychological process. And how do you deal with it as a psychologist with unconditional positive regard so I think that this psychology of migrant Palestinians, it's also a whole different world. It is not separate from what's going on in Palestine. Thank you.
Maybe one practical remark. We have like 5 more minutes time-wise for the space also. Yeah.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much, everyone, for your remarks. I thought it was incredibly stimulating, and I have a lot of questions. still. I think one that I have, and is based on what you were sharing, Donna, like, first of all, I completely agree. Like, if we talk about what it means to not be apolitical when we are aware of structural violence, of structural injustice, of who we have, you know, across from us in the room, and some imagination of what they've been through. Like, if that's what we call being political, I completely agree. But I was also really touched by what you shared about the patients that were Jewish that came to the clinician that was from an Islamic background, and their doubt if that would be a good fit. And I know that this is incidental, right? It's not proving anything, but I wonder if we rid ourselves of so-called neutrality, or if there would have been a very outspoken pro-Israel like message, say in her biography, would these people have still come across each other in the room? And so my question is, do you see any downside to giving away of neutrality specifically in the clinical space, so not in the larger social systemic space?
I think there's neutrality. I find neutrality a very difficult word. I think it's more like professional distance, or not saying things, lack of disclosure, more than neutrality, I would think. And I think you can never have a good working relationship with a patient when you harm yourself and your own values. But I do think that you can empathize for a patient that is perhaps Jewish, has always been told that he or she is extremely unsafe in the world, apart from Israel, and this is the only safe place. And you don't, to me, it's a myth, but it's a myth that people have been raised with. And if they're very afraid because of, then I can still sympathize with somebody if it's a doctor-patient relationship, and you don't really have to go into the political part of it. So yes, I think sometimes it can help, but if somebody's really saying, I think all Palestinians should be eradicated, I think I would stop the relationship. I don't think it would be possible for me. I think it wouldn't be fair to the patient, and it would definitely not be fair to myself and my own health.
Can I add one small thing as well? Just to this. Do you know actually what's the political opinions of those people? Because they could have been Jewish anti-Zionist. You don't know.
No, I don't know. No.
Because I think also, like, one of the things, and I have many Palestinian friends, and some of them have, Jewish Israeli psychologists and therapists, and some of them have stopped their treatments. The ones especially that have, like, let's say, people who treat them that they don't align on basic values. And when we say basic values, it's like equality from the river to the sea. That's the basic value. And if the person doesn't agree with that value, like, it's hard. So I have a friend, like, she knew this person for 7 years, and then she stopped because she realized that even after those 7 years, they reach a place where they cannot really connect on this very basic thing, while others continued. So I think it also goes to this place of connecting on a value level, not only, like, who you are as an identity, but also on that level.
I think these patients that we spoke about, I don't think it even went to a political level, and I think but it's just the feeling of unsafety, which is not, which didn't have a political, but more an identity and a trauma base, I think. Yeah.
Very shortly, and then I think we need to slowly wrap up.
I just want to say that some of the work, I work also specifically with perpetrators of crimes, like people who committed all types of crimes, and I do think that they also deserve mental health care, right? So that is extremely important, and I feel, right, when we speak about ways of changing neutrality in this way, we should really look at, what we're saying here when we're discussing that. And
Yeah, I just feel very strongly about answering this one as well. Sorry.
Yeah, me too.
But I think there is a big difference between individuals and systems. But this is really crucial, I think, for this point, because I can empathize with someone who got hurt, but I need to look also at the system part and which system this person is. Like, I will give an example which is maybe very far, but also to make it more clear. When the slavery was abolished, many slavery masters got hurt, and they lost a lot, and they need to deal with this loss. And on individual basis, some of those people, needed maybe even to be treated. But on a bigger system level, they were part of a system that was exploiting people. So I think we need to realize both, I would say, sides of the coin in this regard. And I will give you more of the space, I'm sorry.
No worries. Yeah. Just very briefly, I just wanted to make a remark. There is an assumption, I think you also responded to that there is some level of neutrality possible in a therapeutic diet. And I don't think that's possible, because even as I'm sitting here as a Middle Eastern male with a beard, I'm just sending out social meaning to you guys, and also to my patients without even noticing it. And you too. I don't see you, but I think you do too. So it's a natural process within psychotherapy that people need to respond to each other's identities and signals. And the art of therapy is not so much of doing therapy with your mirror image. The art is trying to find a new dance with someone with a different background and with different values. And I think our basic instrument within psychotherapy is quite effective also in this context. I mean, you have transference and countertransference. When it's manageable, you can do psychotherapy. When it gets out of hand, it's maybe time to intervene or maybe depart ways, as we always do with our patients and they do with us. So I think that shouldn't be necessarily a barrier to do justice work, not within the session with that patient, but collectively outside that room. And I also want to acknowledge your point that everyone deserves mental health care. That's very important. Yeah.
Can I make one last point on that?
Oh, yeah.
I think fundamentally, when we talk about disrupting regimes of violence, that includes aggressors. There's only one, the ideology of violence is the only one that structures things based on hierarchies in which who deserves care and who doesn't deserve care. The fact that we might focus on who might need our immediate attention is precisely because there's a historic oppressive system that has written them out of the equation to begin with. But when we dream of a new world that is free of domination, extraction, and exploitation, that also means we dream of a world in which perpetration doesn't come to be. The conditions under which perpetrators come to be perpetrators no longer exist either. One side doesn't acknowledge that, the other does, right? So I do think that when we speak of dismantling systems of oppression, the implication is already there, that we are saying everybody, it needs to be a distribution of care across the board that is fundamentally not based on a hierarchy of being.
Thank you. I think we have to wrap up. Yeah. I'd like to thank all the speakers tonight, Sophie, Sam, Donna, Lara, and Rana, for your stories and your insights. I would like to thank Pakhuis de Zwijger for being able to organize this event tonight, and of course the audience for attending. I hope this evening has inspired you or made you feel a sense of connection with like-minded mental health professionals. And I'd like to end tonight with a quote by Palestinian author Ghassan Kanafani. He said, "We will not be brought down by guns, but by our silence." Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all.